The slanderous report. When Moses heard that the spies had returned, he went to his house of study where all Israel assembled. It was a square of 12 miles, affording room for all. The spies were requested then to give their report. Pursuing the tactics of slanderers, they began by extolling the land, so that their report might not be too unfavorable, and thereby arouse suspicion. They said, "We went to the land where you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey." This was not an exaggeration, for honey flowed from under the trees which the goats grazed, out of whose udders poured milk, so that both milk and honey moistened the ground. But they used these words only as an introduction, and then passed on to their actual report, which they had elaborated during those 40 days, and by means of which they hoped to be able to induce the people to desist from their plan of entering Palestine. "Nevertheless," they continued, "the people are strong in that land, and the cities are walled, and very great, and moreover, we saw children of Anak there." Concerning the latter they spoke an untruth, with the intention of inspiring Israel with fear. For the sons of Anak dwell in Hebron, where Caleb alone had gone to pray at the grave of the patriarchs. To intensify to the uttermost their fear of the inhabitants of Palestine, they furthermore said, "The Amalekites dwell in the land of the south." They threatened Israel with Amalek as one threatens a child with a strap that had once been used to chastise him, for they had had bitter experiences with Amalek. The statement concerning Amalek was founded on fact, for although southern Palestine had not originally been their home, still they had recently settled there in obedience to the last wish of their forefather Esau, who had bidden them to cut off Israel from their entrance to the Promised Land. "If, however," continued the spies in their report, "you are planning to enter the land from the mountain region in order to evade Amalek, understand that the Hittites, Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the mountains, and if you plan to go there by sea, the Canaanites live by the sea, and along the Jordan." As soon as the spies had completed their report, Joshua arose to contradict them, but they gave him no chance to speak, calling out to him, "By what right do you, foolish man, presume to speak? You have neither sons nor daughters, so what do you care if we perish in our attempt to conquer the land? We, on the other hand, have to look out for our children and wives." Joshua, therefore, very much against his will, had to be silent. Caleb now considered in what way he could manage to get a hearing without being shouted down as Joshua had been. Caleb had given his comrades an entirely false impression concerning his sentiments, for when these formed the plan to try and make Israel desist from entering Palestine, they drew him into their council, and he pretended to agree with them. Hence, when Caleb arose, the spies were silent, supposing he would go along with their statements, a supposition which his introductory words tended to strengthen. He began, "Be silent. I will reveal the truth. This is not all for which we have to thank the son of Amram." But to the amazement of the spies, his next words praised, not blamed Moses. He said, "Moses, it is he who drew us up out of Egypt, parted the sea for us, and gave us manna as food." In this way he continued his discourse on Moses, closing with the words, "We should obey him even if he told us to ascend to heaven on ladders." These words of Caleb were heard by all the people, for his words were so mighty that they could be heard 12 miles off. It was this same powerful voice that had saved the life of the spies, for when the Canaanites first took note of them and suspected them of being spies, the 3 giants, Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, pursued them and caught up with them in the plain of Judea. When Caleb, hidden beneath a fence, saw that the giants were at their heels, he uttered such a shout that the giants fell down in a swoon because of the frightful din. When they had recovered, the giants told them they had pursued them only because they had suspected them of wanting to burn their cities. Caleb's mighty voice did not, however, in the least impress the people or the spies, For the latter, far from retracting their previous statements, went so far as to say, "We are not able to go up against that people, for they are stronger than we are. They are so strong that even God cannot get at them. The land through which we have gone is a land that eats up the inhabitants through disease, and all the people that we saw in it are men of wicked traits. And here we saw men, at the sight of whom we almost swooned in fright, the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of giants. And we were in their sight as grasshoppers." At these last words, God said, "I have no objection to your saying, 'We were in our sight as grasshoppers,' but I take amiss if you say, 'And so we were in their sight.' For how can you tell how I made you appear in their sight? How do you know you did not appear to them to be angels?" The Night of Tears. The words of the spies were heard by willing ears. The people believed them implicitly, and when called to task by Moses, they replied, "Oh, our teacher Moses, if there had been only 2 spies or 3, we would still have to give credence to their words. For the law tells us to consider the testimony of even 2 as sufficient, whereas in this case there are fully 10. Our spies have made us faint of heart. Because the Lord hates us, he has brought us out of the land of Egypt, to deliver us into the hand of the Amorites, to destroy us." By these words they revealed that they hated God, and for this reason they believed that they were hated by him. For whatever a man wishes on his neighbor, he believes his neighbor wishes on him. They even tried to convince Moses that God hated them. They said, "If an earthly king has 2 sons and 2 fields, one watered by a river and the other dependent upon rains, will he not give the one that is watered by the river to his favorite son, and give the other, the less excellent field, to his other son? God led us out of Egypt, a land that is not dependent on rain, only to give us the land of Canaan, which produces only if it rains." Not only did the spies voice their opinion that it was not advisable to attempt the conquering of Palestine, but they employed every means of inciting the people into rebellion against Moses and God. On the following evening, each of the spies went to his house, put on grieving clothes, and began to weep and lament bitterly. Their families quickly ran toward them, and in astonishment asked the reason for these tears and lamentations. And without interrupting their wailings, they answered, "Woe is me for you, my sons, and woe is me for you, my daughters and daughters-in-law, who are doomed to be dishonored by the uncircumcised and given as a prey to their lusts. These men that we have beheld are not like mortals. They are strong and mighty as angels. One of them could well kill 1,000 of us. How can we look into the iron faces of men so powerful that a nail of theirs could stop up a spring of water?" At these words, all the household, sons, daughters, and daughters-in-law, burst into tears and loud lamentations. Their neighbors came running and joined in the wails and sobs until they spread throughout all the camp, and all 60 myriads of people were weeping. When the sound of their weeping reached heaven, God said, "You weep today without a cause. I shall see to it that in the future you shall have a cause." It was then that God decreed to destroy the temple on the 9th day of Ab, the day on which Israel in the wilderness wept without cause, so that this day became forever a day of tears. The people were not, however, content with tears. They resolved to set up leaders in place of Moses and Aaron, Dathan and Abiram, and under their guidance to return to Egypt. But worse than this, not only did they renounce their leader, but also their God, for they denied him and wished to set up an idol for their God. Not only the wicked ones among them, such as the mixed multitude, demurred against Moses and Aaron, but those also who had before been pious, saying, "Would to God that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would to God we had died in this wilderness." When Joshua and Caleb heard these speeches of the people, teeming with blasphemy, they tore their garments and tried to restrain the people from their sinful enterprise, exhorting them particularly not to have fear of the Canaanites. because the time was at hand when God had promised Abraham to give the land of Canaan to his descendants, and because there were no pious men among the inhabitants of that land, for whose sake God would have been willing to leave it longer in their possession. They also assured the people that God had thrown from heaven the guardian angel of the inhabitants of Palestine, so that they were now impotent. The people, however, replied, "We do not believe you. The other spies have our health and safety more at heart than you do." Nor were the admonitions of Moses of any use, even though he brought them a direct message from God to have no fear of the Canaanites. In vain he said to them, "He who brought all those miracles for you in Egypt and during your stay in the wilderness will work miracles for you as well when you enter the promised land. Truly, the past ought to inspire you with trust in the future." The only answer the people had to this was, "Had we heard this report of the land from strangers, we should not have given it credit, but we have heard it from men whose sons are our sons, and whose daughters are our daughters." In their bitterness against their leaders, they wanted to lay hands on Moses and Aaron. Then God sent his cloud of glory as a protection to them, under which they sought refuge. But, far from being brought to a realization of their wicked enterprise by this divine apparition, they cast stones at the cloud, hoping in this way to kill Moses and Aaron. This outrage completely wore out God's patience, and he determined upon the destruction of the spies and a severe punishment of the people misled by them. Ingratitude punished. God now appeared to Moses, bidding him to convey the following words to the people. "You kindle my anger on account of the very benefits I have given you. When I divided the sea for you, that you might pass through, with the Egyptians stuck in the mud at its bottom, you said to one another, 'In Egypt we trod mud, and he led us out of Egypt, only that we might again trod it.' I gave you manna as food, which made you strong and fat, but you said, 'Now it will come to pass that in 20 days we will die, for after 4 or 5 days we do not excrete this food which we have taken in. Surely we are doomed.' When the spies came to Palestine, I arranged it so that as soon as they entered the city, its king or governor died, in order that the inhabitants, occupied with the burial of their ruler, might not take account of the spies' presence and kill them. Instead of being thankful for this, the spies returned and reported, 'The land through which we have gone to search is a land that eats up its inhabitants. To you I gave the Torah. For your sake I said to the angel of death, continue to hold sway over the rest of the world, but not over this nation I have chosen as my people. Truly I had hopes that after all this you would sin no more, and like myself and the angels would live eternally, without ever tasting death. You, however, in spite of the great opportunity I offered you, conducted yourselves like Adam. Upon him I also put a commandment, promising him eternal life on condition he observed it. But he brought ruin upon himself by trespassing and eating of the tree. To him I said, Dust you are, and unto dust you shall return. Similar was my experience with you. I said, You are angels, but you conducted yourself like Adam in your sins, and hence, like Adam, you must die. I had thought and hoped you would follow the example of the patriarchs, but you act like the inhabitants of Sodom, who, in punishment for their sins, were consumed by fire. If, he continued, turning to Moses, they suppose that I have need of swords or spears to destroy them, they are mistaken. As through the word I created the world, so can I destroy the world by a word, which would be a proper punishment for them, as through their words and their talk they angered me. So shall the word kill them, and you shall be their heir. For I will make of you a greater and mightier nation than they. Moses said, If the chair with 3 legs could not withstand the moment of your wrath, how then shall a chair that has but 1 leg endure? You are about to destroy the seed of the 3 patriarchs. How then may I hope that my seed is to fare better? This is not the only reason for which you should preserve Israel, as there are other considerations why you should do so. Were you to destroy Israel, the Edomites, Moabites, and all the inhabitants of Canaan would say that you had done this only because you were not able to maintain your people, and therefore you destroyed them. They will furthermore declare that the gods of Canaan are mightier than those of Egypt, that you had indeed triumphed over the river gods, but that you were not equal to the rain gods of Canaan. Worse even than this, the nations of the world will accuse you of continuous cruelty, saying, He destroyed the generation of the flood through water. He brought to the ground the builders of the tower, as well as the inhabitants of Sodom, and no better than theirs was the fate of the Egyptians, whom he drowned in the sea. Now he has also ruined Israel, whom he had called my firstborn son, like Lilith who, when she can find no strange children, slays her own. So he killed his own son. Moses furthermore said, Every pious man makes a point of cultivating a special virtue. You also, in this instance, should bring your special virtue to bear. God, and what is my special virtue? Moses, long-suffering, love, and mercy. For you are wont to be long-suffering with them that kindle your wrath, and to have mercy for them. In your mercy your strength is best shown. Mete out to your children, then, justice in small measure, but mercy in great measure. Moses well knew that mercy was God's chief virtue. He remembered that he had asked God, when he interceded for Israel after their sin of the golden calf, Pray, tell me by what attribute you rule the world. God answered, I rule the world with loving kindness, mercy, and long-suffering. Can it be, said Moses, that your long-suffering lets sinners think they can get off with impunity? To this question Moses had received no answer, hence he felt he might now say to God, Act now as you did then. Justice that demands the destruction of Israel is on one side of the scales, but it is exactly balanced by my prayer on the other side. Let us now see how the scales will balance. God replied, As truly as you live, Moses, your prayer shall dip the scales to the side of mercy. For your sake I will cancel my decision to annihilate the children of Israel, so that the Egyptians will exclaim, Happy the servant to whose wish his master defers. I shall, however, collect my debt. For though I will not annihilate Israel all at once, they will make partial payments during the following 40 years. Say to them, You will fall dead in the desert, the whole number of you that came out of Egypt, from 20 years old and upward, which have murmured against me. Your children will be wanderers in the wilderness for 40 years, until your carcasses are consumed. This punishment was not, however, as severe as it might appear. For none of them died below the age of 60, whereas those who had at the time of the exodus from Egypt below 20 or above 60 were entirely exempt from this punishment. Besides, only such were smitten as had followed the counsel of the spies. The others, and the Levites and the women, were exempt. Death, moreover, visited the transgressors in such a fashion that they were aware it was meant as a punishment for their sins. Throughout the next year not one among them died, but on the 8th day of the month of Ab, Moses had a herald proclaim throughout the camp, Let each prepare his grave. They dug their graves and spent the following night in them, the same night on which, following the counsel of the spies, they had revolted against God and Moses. In the morning a herald cried, Let the living separate themselves from the dead. Those that were still alive arose, but about 15,000 of them remained dead in their graves. After 40 years, however, when the herald repeated his customary call on the 9th day of Ab, all arose, and there was not a single dead man among them. At first they thought they had made a miscalculation in their observation of the moon, that it was not the 9th day of Ab at all, and that this was the reason why their lives had been spared. So they repeated their preparations for death until the 15th day of Ab. Then the sight of the full moon convinced them that the 9th day of Ab had gone by, and that their punishment had been done away with. In commemoration for this relief from punishment, they appointed the 15th day of Ab to be a holy day. The Years of Disfavor. Although God had now canceled his resolution to annihilate Israel, he was not yet quite reconciled with them, and they were out of favor during the following years of their march through the desert, as was made evidence by several circumstances. During these years of disfavor, the north wind did not blow, with the result that the boys who were born in the desert could not be circumcised, as the absence of the wind produced an excessively high temperature, a condition that made it very dangerous for the young boys to have this operation. As the law, however, prohibits the offering of the Paschal lamb unless the boys have been circumcised, Israel could not properly observe the feast of Passover after the incident of the spies. Moses also felt the effects of disfavor, for during this time he received from God nothing but the absolutely essential directions, and no other revelations. This was because Moses, like all other prophets, received his distinction only for the sake of Israel, and when Israel was in disgrace, God did not communicate with him affectionately. Indeed, Moses' fate, to die in the desert without entering the Promised Land, had been decreed simultaneously with the fate of the generation led out of Egypt. But the most terrible punishment fell on the spies, who, with their wicked tongues, had brought about the whole disaster. God repaid them measure for measure. Their tongues stretched to so great a length that they touched their navels, and worms crawled out from their tongues and pierced the navel. In this horrible fashion, these men died. Joshua and Caleb, however, who had remained true to God and had not followed the wicked counsel of their colleagues, were not only exempt from death, but were furthermore rewarded by receiving in the Holy Land the property that had been allotted to the other spies. Caleb was 40 years of age when he was sent out as a spy. He had married early and at the age of 10 had begotten a son. Still, at the age of 85, he was sturdy enough to enjoy his possession in the Holy Land. God's mercy is also extended to sinners. Hence, he told Moses to say to the people, "The Amalekites and the Canaanites are now dwelling in the valley. Tomorrow we turn and go into the wilderness by way of the Red Sea." God did this because he had firmly resolved that in the event of war between Israel and the inhabitants of Palestine, not to aid Israel. Knowing that in this case their annihilation was sure, he commanded them to make no attempt to enter the Holy Land by force. "It had been my intention," said God, "to exalt you, but now, if you were to attempt to make war on Palestine, you would suffer humiliation." The people did not, however, hear the words of God that Moses communicated to them, and all at once formed in battle array in order to advance against the Amorites. They thought that after having confessed their sin of having been misled by the spies, God would surely stand by them in battle. So they said to Moses, "Surely these few drops have not filled the bucket." Their transgression against God seemed to them only a small thing that had long since been forgiven. They were, however, mistaken. Like bees, the enemy swarmed on them. And whereas in former times they had fallen dead of fright on hearing the names of the Israelites, now a blow from them sufficed to kill Israelites. Their attempt to wage war without the Holy Ark in their midst proved a miserable failure. Many of them, and Zelophehad among them, met their death, and many more returned to camp covered with wounds. The wailing and weeping of the people was of no avail. God persisted in his resolve, and they brought on themselves grave punishment for this new proof of disobedience. For God said to Moses, "If I were to deal with them now in accordance with strict justice, they should never enter the land. After a while, however, I shall give them possession of the land, which I swore to their fathers." In order to comfort and encourage Israel in their dejection, Moses received directions to announce the law of sacrifices and other precepts laid down for life in the Holy Land, that the people might see that God did not mean to be angry with them forever. When Moses announced the laws to them, a dispute arose between the Israelites and the converts, because the former declared that they alone and not the others were to make offerings to God in the sanctuary. God then called Moses and said, "Why do they always quarrel with one another?" Moses replied, "You know why." God, "Have I not said to you, one law and one ordinance shall be for you and also for the stranger that travels with you?" Although the 40 years' march through the desert was a punishment for the sin of Israel, still it had one advantage. At the time when Israel departed from Egypt, Palestine was in poor condition. The trees planted in the time of Noah were old and withered. Hence God said, "Shall I have Israel enter a poor land? I will bid them to wander in the desert for 40 years, and the Canaanites may in the meantime fell the old trees and plant new ones, so that Israel, on entering the land, may find it abounding in plenty." So it came to pass, for when Israel conquered Palestine, they found the land not only newly cultivated, but also filled to overflowing with treasures. The inhabitants of this land were such misers that they would not indulge in a drop of oil for their gruel. If an egg broke, they didn't use it, but sold it for cash. The hoardings of these miserly Canaanites God later gave to Israel to enjoy and use. The Rebellion of Korah. The Canaanites were not the only ones who did not enjoy their wealth and money, for a similar fate was decreed for Korah. He had been the treasurer of Pharaoh, and possessed treasures so vast that he employed 300 white mules to carry the keys of his treasures. But let not the rich man boast of his riches, for Korah, through his sin, lost both life and property. Korah had obtained possession of his riches in the following way. When Joseph, during the lean years, through the sale of grain amassed great treasures, he erected 3 great buildings, 100 cubits wide, 100 cubits long, and 100 high, filled them with money, and delivered them to Pharaoh, being too honest to leave even 5 silver shekels of this money to his children. Korah uncovered one of these 3 great treasuries, and on account of his wealth he became proud, and his pride brought about his fall. He thought Moses had slighted him by appointing his cousin Elzaphan as chief of the Levite division of Kohathites. He said to himself, "My grandfather had 4 sons, Amram, Ishar, Hebron, and Uzziel. Amram, as the firstborn, had privileges of which his sons availed themselves, for Aaron is high priest and Moses is king. But have not I, the son of Ishar, the second son of Kohath, the rightful claim to be a prince of the Kohathites? Moses, however, passed me by and appointed Elzaphan, whose father was Uzziel, the youngest son of my grandfather. Therefore, I'll now stir up rebellion against Moses and overthrow all institutions founded by him." Korah was far too wise to believe that God would permit success to a rebellion against Moses and stand by indifferently. But the very insight that enabled him to look into the future became his doom. He saw with his prophetic eye that Samuel, a man as great as both Aaron and Moses together, would be one of his descendants. And furthermore, the 24 descendants of his, inspired by the Holy Spirit, would compose psalms and sing in the temple. This brilliant future of his descendants inspired him with great confidence in his undertaking, for he thought to himself that God would not permit the father of such pious men to perish. His eye did not, however, look sharply enough into the future, or else he would have known that his sons would repent of the rebellion against Moses, and would for this reason be deemed worthy of becoming the fathers of prophets and temple singers, whereas he was to perish in his rebellion. The names of this unfortunate rebel corresponded to his deed and to his end. He was called Korah, baldness, for through the death of his followers he caused a baldness in Israel. He was the son of Ishar, the heat of the noon, because he caused the earth to boil like the heat of the noon. And furthermore, he was designated as the son of Kohath, for Kohath signifies bluntness, and through his sin he made his children's teeth set on edge. His description as the son of Levi, conduct, points to his end, for he was conducted to hell. Korah, however, was not the only one who strove to overthrow Moses. With him were the Reubenites Dathan and Abiram, who well deserve their names, for the one signifies transgressor of the divine law, and the other the obdurate. There were furthermore 250 men who by their rank and influence belonged to the most prominent people in Israel, among them even the princes of the tribes. In the union of the Reubenites with Korah was verified the proverb, "Woe to the wicked, and woe to his neighbor." For Korah, one of the sons of Kohath, had his station to the south of the tabernacle, and as the Reubenites were also encamped there, a friendship was struck up between them, so that they followed him in his undertaking against Moses. The hatred Korah felt for Moses was still more kindled by his wife. When, after the consecration of the Levites, Korah returned home, his wife noticed that the hairs of his head and his body had been shaved, and asked him who had done this. He answered, "Moses." Then his wife remarked, "Moses hates you, and did this to disgrace you." Korah replied, "Moses shaved the hair of his own sons also." But she said, "The disgrace of his sons didn't matter to him if he thought he could disgrace you. He was quite ready to make that sacrifice." As at home, so also did Korah fare with others, for, hairless as he was, no one at first recognized him, and when people at last discovered who was before them, they asked in astonishment who had disfigured him. In answer to their inquiries, he said, "Moses did this, and also took hold of my hands and feet to lift me, and after he lifted me, he said, 'You are clean.' But his brother Aaron he adorned like a bride, and told him to take his place in the tabernacle." Embittered by what they considered an insult, Korah and his people exclaimed, "Moses is king, his brother he appointed as high priest, his nephews as heads of the priests, and he allots to these priests the heave offering and many other tributes." Then he tried to make Moses appear ridiculous in the eyes of the people. Shortly before this, Moses had read to the people the law of the purple fringes in the borders of their garments. Korah now had garments of purple made for the 250 men that followed him, all of whom were chief justices. Dressed so, Korah and his company appeared before Moses and asked him if they were required to attach fringes to the corners of these garments. Moses answered, "Yes." Korah then began this argument. "If," he said, "one fringe of purple suffices to fulfill this commandment, should not a whole garment of purple answer the requirements, even if there is no special fringe of purple in the corners?" He continued to lay before Moses similar artful questions. Must a mezuzah be attached to the doorpost of a house filled with sacred books? Moses answered, "Yes." Then Korah said, 270 sections of the Torah are not sufficient, whereas 2 sections attached to the doorpost suffice? Korah put still another question. If on a man's skin there shows a bright spot the size of half a bean, is he clean or unclean? Moses, "Unclean." And, continued Korah, if the spot spreads over all of his skin, is he then clean or unclean? Moses, "Clean." "Law is so irrational," said Korah, "cannot possibly come from the origin of God. The Torah that you teach to Israel is not God's work, but your work. Hence you are no prophet, and Aaron is no high priest." Next, Korah abuses Moses and the Torah. End part 62 of 95, thelegendsofthejews.com.